Hey, hello. As you are probably aware, it is August, or maybe it is not August for you, and you are coming to us from the future, in which case, thank you for being here even in not August. But even though we missed July's anticipated releases, I thought we could get back in the groove, or more accurately, I could get back in the groove, and we can talk about anticipated releases coming up for August. But before we jump into that completely, hi, my name is Melody. On this channel we talk about books and book adjacent things wherever my kind of reading life is taking me. And if that sounds good to you, I would love to have you along both today and in the future with a subscription, but I'm not your mom and I'm not going to tell you what to do. What I can tell you are the books that I am excited about for August, and it is a longer list than it would have been if I had actually gotten July finished. So let's go ahead and jump into them, as I always talk much more than I anticipate when I sit down on this couch. And by the way, the chips have kind of fallen this month with release dates. I am saving one of my most anticipated books of the month for last, which was also one that should have been in my mid-year check-in tag as one of my most anticipated releases for the second half of the year that I forgot about, which is not a reflection on my anticipation or excitement for the book and just me not having everything together in that moment. But hold tight for that, and let's jump in to the first new release Tuesday of the month on August 6th first, where we are starting strong with another book I'm very excited about by an author who was behind, or who wrote, one of my favorite books of last year, A Study in Drowning. So this year we have Lady Macbeth by Ava Reid, and this sounds like it is going to be exactly what you would anticipate from a book titled Lady Macbeth, in that it is a kind of reimagining of Lady Macbeth from Shakespeare's Macbeth. So kind of taking the story of Macbeth from Lady Macbeth's point of view. And if you are a fan of Shakespeare, if you have any history in the theater at all, if you took a high school English class, I remember I wrote a paper about Lady Macbeth my senior year, and Lady Macbeth is one of the most interesting Shakespearean characters, I think, especially her journey in kind of the last half of the play. There is just so much meat to that role for actresses. It is kind of one of the most interesting Shakespearean roles for a lot of actresses. I am not speaking in absolutes here because I am not an actress, but I think that there's just a lot to really dig into there, and she is a very complex character. And one of the things that has always made her a very interesting character is her kind of villainy in some cases, in perspectives, especially in terms of her ambition and what she is willing to do to see that ambition realized, whether she is the power behind Macbeth and a lot of the choices that are made in that play, what have you. And so I am very interested to see it told from this point of view, especially as it seems that we are going to be diving in to more of those mythical leanings. And I know that seems kind of obvious. I mean, Macbeth has witches, but I really like productions of Macbeth that really lean into that witch imagery and just the exploration of the witches in Macbeth. And I've been very lucky in my own life as a theater goer in getting to see that realized, both in a production of Macbeth that took place in college. I want to say I was a freshman. Yes, I was a freshman, that had really interesting exploration of the witches. And I saw a production at Chicago Shakespeare a couple of years ago, more than a couple now, that was similarly really interested in exploring the power of the witches and making them a little threatening, or a lot threatening and powerful and weird, the weird sisters for sure there. And so I'm very interested in what this book is going to explore in that vein as well. If there will be any overlap with the witches and Lady Macbeth, I don't know. But on top of that thematic exploration and just the source material it's pulling from, I also think Reid's voice really intrigues me in relation to this storytelling, and I'm very excited to see how her voice kind of overlaps on top of this story that is a little bit darker and more complex, which I also felt her voice achieved really well in A Study in Drowning. And I do admittedly still need to read my copy of The Wolf and the Woodsman because, you know, the never-ending TBR, but I anticipate a similar voice there as well. And how I haven't read that book yet when it involves the woods, I don't even want to think about, but very excited about this one for sure. Next, we have a debut contemporary romance, The Truth According to Ember by Danica Nava. This is following a woman, Ember, who gets caught up in a lie that snowballs when she is job hunting and having trouble getting follow-ups, getting interviews. And so she changes her ethnicity on her applications from Native American to white, and suddenly she has a job, and a job that she is very successful in and very happy at. And amidst this new job, she meets a fellow Native on staff, and they get along really well. They start flirting, they develop a relationship, and then on a work trip, they are caught in this relationship, and the coworker that catches them starts to blackmail Ember. And Ember's lies, though born of self-preservation, start to snowball and compound, and she has to decide if she is going to tell the truth, even if that truth will cost her everything. And so I'm just excited for a new voice in romance. I'm excited for more diverse romance to explore and new perspectives. Also, in that I don't generally enjoy like lies as a central conceit of my romances or fiction more generally, even a lot of the time. However, here that lie feels more rooted and I understand the impetus of it. It feels born of necessity in a lot of ways. And so I'm really interested to see how that comes into the exploration of everything. And I think that there's just a lot of good commentary that this is setting up within its conceit as well. And then we have a new T. Kingfisher retelling with A Sorceress Comes to Call, which I believe looks like it is a full-length retelling and it's not a novella. And so this is a Goose Girl retelling, and I will admit that it has been a long time since I touched the original text for the Goose Girl or even read any retellings of it myself. I actually don't know if I have read a retelling since I read the Shannon Hale retelling when I was in high school, probably. When did it come out? 2005, so high school. So yeah, I don't know what this is going to be, but with T. Kingfisher, it's going to be a little dark and twisted. We can expect that. And from the blurb too, we can expect that because it lays out a girl, Cordelia, who based on the way the relationship with her mother, the sorceress, is described in this blurb, feels a little bit more Rapunzel in terms of the control and the way that her mother keeps her trapped and all of those things. But then one day Cordelia's mother packs them up to go to a wealthy squire and basically has the intent of marrying this wealthy squire, but this wealthy squire also has a sister, Hester, and Hester recognizes the threat in this sorceress and also the way that Cordelia is being treated and has to try to break the spell in many ways, essentially. And with that angle and the way that that's described, and even the way the relationship between Cordelia and her mother are set up earlier in the blurb, there very much seem to be horror elements here and that darkness that T. Kingfisher brings to a lot of her retellings, at least to my knowledge, because I will admit I have not read all of them, and my first T. Kingfisher was A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking, which you would not expect to have that kind of darkness. So I really like seeing that range. I'm really intrigued by this, and the way it's set up here, I think it may also be calling back to the Gothic horror we saw in A House with Good Bones. So very intrigued which way this is gonna go. I feel like it's already been getting a decent amount of buzz. I think it is a book of the month pick for the month, so I anticipate this being talked about a lot in August. Next we have House of Bone and Rain by Gabino Iglesias, which follows a group of childhood friends, young men. I'm not sure their exact age. The way the blurb is worded, I am inclined to think like older adolescents, like on the verge of adulthood and coming fully into their own, because this book does seem to be kind of placed in that in-between in its explorations, and I'm very excited about the in-between, hold on. But it's kind of set off by the murder of the mother of one of this group of friends, and they have vowed to take revenge, and then find out that the person that they have declared revenge against is the drug kingpin of Puerto Rico. But they still plot and are coming up with a way to go up against this man that no one has ever successfully gone up against while a hurricane is on the way in. And so we have this sense of an incoming storm, but the way the blurb describes this, so we have the outside that reflects the kind of inside turmoil of these characters' lives, which is already engaging and a great setting for things, but we seem to have another kind of supernatural kind of mythical element at play here as well. Let me read the last paragraph of this blurb because it sounds right up my alley. It says, blurring the boundaries between myth, mythicism, and the grim realities of our world, House of Bone and Rain is a harrowing coming-of-age story, a doomed tale of devotion, the afterlife of violence, and what rolls in on the tide, which I think is some great copywriting. But I just love this idea that there is something else at play amidst this storm, and that makes it feel like maybe there is more to be said about this otherwise doomed mission as well. It seems to have a really good forward momentum behind things, and also to be seemingly exploring the impact of violence and the way violence persists while using language elsewhere in the blurb that invokes this idea of evil spirits as well. So I'm just very, very interested to see what this is going to be, because I think this is horror in its categorization, and I think that there's just so much potential here, and especially with that setting of an island on the brink of a hurricane too. Like, that's just such a great kind of setting in time and circumstance amidst this upheaval and this turmoil already, in terms of, like I said, the emotional journey of these characters, which, again, I have not read this book yet, but I'm just really excited by the possibility. Speaking of horror, because apparently I read horror or horror adjacent things pretty regularly now, at least by how these books are popularly categorized more broadly, we have The Unmothers by Leslie J. Anderson, which is out of Quirk Books. And I will admit, I haven't read Quirk Books' full catalog, and I don't think I've read a Quirk Books title recently, but I do remember, at least when they first launched, their titles were very hit or miss for me, in that they usually had excellent premises, but the execution just often fell flat for me. It felt like it was writing a lot on the idea, and the book itself, the execution of that book, didn't always work for me. But I remain hopeful. I'm not trying to like bash an entire imprint here or publishing house, however they're actually categorized, by any means, but I recognize that it can be very hit or miss for me, and this does seem to be a very high concept idea, so I'm really hopeful that it is executed fully. It also kind of reminds me, tangentially, not at all the same idea here, of the book Broken Monsters by Lauren Bukes, and that reminds me that I have some Lauren Bukes titles that I need to circle back to because I think I'm behind. But this follows a journalist who, after a tragedy in her own life, is sent on assignment to this remote town with a ridiculous claim that a horse has given birth to a baby boy. And she shows up and she finds a kind of very insular community, and also realizes that the horses are treated very well, even in comparison to the humans in this community. And then on top of that, a person and a horse are found dead in a field, and what is going on? So this feels like the most twisted version of Horse Girl energy, and I'm honestly expecting that to be a turn or a reference of some kind in this book, but I'm very interested in what exactly this is exploring, and if it's got a larger commentary piece to it as well, or if it's just all about the oddness of the kind of given circumstances or whatever it's setting up. I don't know. We'll see. And as someone who was not a horse girl growing up, I knew of horses. I grew up in the country. There were horses. I was in 4-H country, but I've never ridden a horse. I don't really, or have never really, spent any amount of time around horses, so I might not really be the best audience for this book. I don't know, but I'm very intrigued by the concept. And then in this moment, a book that I realize is a very odd follow-up to the concept that is kind of set up in the previous book. We have Dark Restraint by Katie Robert, which is the 7th in the Dark Olympus series, and a reminder that I am now again officially behind in the Dark Olympus series, and this is following Ariadne and her presumed marriage to Dionysus, but her real relationship with, unsurprisingly, if you know your mythology, or have read any of the other books, the Minotaur. It seems to be, based on the blurb, a very toxic relationship. I am very interested because I feel like we got to see a lot more of the Minotaur in Cruel Seduction. I don't know if we got more. I would assume so if his book, or Ariadne's book, is next. We got more of either one of them in Midnight Rain. It just seems like Eurydice wouldn't have as much of a vehicle for that, but we do have the overarching plot of this series still pushing forward, and I'm very, very intrigued to see where that is going. I'm very invested, if nothing else, to get to Zeus and Hera's book, which I am sure is last, and we gotta keep seeing where the world is building to in order to get to that last book. So we will read this, or I will read this. I cannot speak for you. I just need to catch back up. And then in the first potentially romantasy adjacent book that has caught my attention in a second, I'm not averse to this subgenre by any means. I just haven't had anything that's really sparked that interest for me. And admittedly, I have been in a bit of a reading slump this year, at least for me. But this book has definitely caught my interest. And to be fair, I don't know if it is romantasy officially, but it is definitely paranormal, supernatural, though it seems to have its own kind of in-world mythology, and more importantly amidst that, it is set in Jazz Age Harlem, which I think is just such an interesting setting, historical setting, that we don't get to see nearly enough. And this has the added kind of boon of what essentially seem to be vampires in this world. It looks like there is a little bit more going on, but without having read the book fully, I don't really have a sense of what that is. And so it looks like it may be your kind of typical, but with its own twist, kind of vampire hunter setup in Jazz Age Harlem, with two characters who have a history and have to band together in order to solve an in-world mystery, in that maybe some of these vampire-esque creatures are becoming human again, or more human. I don't fully know the mythology of this world, but I'm very intrigued by that. And so these two characters, Elise and Layla, who were once great friends, now enemies, are trying to solve this mystery together. So we've got friends to enemies to question mark. I know where I think it's going, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. But either way, I'm very intrigued by the supernatural setting of this. I am intrigued by the historical setting of this. I am intrigued by the mythology that is being established here. And I am just really, really hopeful about this one. I think that it is going to be really interesting, really fun, dark, decadent. And because I think I got ahead of myself and just got too excited about it, I don't think I named the book, which is This Ravenous Fate by Haley Dennings. Last, for the 6th, we have the newest Silvia Moreno Garcia book, The Seventh Veil of Salome, which is a deviation from her in that it doesn't have any supernatural elements. That's not to say it doesn't look like it's going to play with form, but it is set in the golden age of Hollywood, and it's following an aspiring Hollywood starlet as she has been cast as Salome in an upcoming movie, and also following her potentially rival who also wanted that role, and then is also exploring Salome herself. So I will be very interested to see how all of those stories kind of weave together. And I'm correcting myself now because I think I mentioned that it was set in the golden age of Hollywood, but it's 1950s Hollywood, because it also makes me think in some ways, though being vastly different clearly, of Neveu's book exploring the golden age of Hollywood, though that had elements of the supernatural in it as well. But I will be very interested to see if they're following similar thematic ideas in context of Hollywood, especially as the seemingly lead character in this book, though it seems like we're going to be following all three women based on the blurb, is the Mexican ingenue who has been cast to play Salome, and how that kind of weaves throughout everything. So I think that she will be driving the story to my kind of perception of this. I haven't read it yet, but I'm very interested to see how everything else weaves in. And again, this is the first major release we're getting from Garcia that isn't kind of mythical or mystical or supernatural or odd in some way. There may still be some odd in there. I don't want to speak too soon, but it is not inherently supernatural or fantastical overtly. So I am very interested in what this is going to be. But with that, let's jump on over to the new releases of August 13th and something that is inherently supernatural with the new romance from Jen DeLuca, who is known for her Renaissance fair romances, Haunted Ever After, which is following a woman who moves into a house in a small town that is seemingly haunted, and this small town in Florida kind of leans in to their perception of being haunted for tourist dollars, including the owner of the local cafe, who seemingly has a ghost roommate, and Cassie, the young woman who has moved into town and this new house, also seems to have a ghost roommate, and this roommate seems a little bit more malignant. And these two get closer as Nick sneaks Cassie extra treats during her visits at the coffee shop, gives her ghost tours around town that are more in-depth than tourists would get, and helps her as she begins to investigate what may be inhabiting her house, or who may be inhabiting her house other than her. So we've been on a kind of kick of paranormal and witchy romances the last couple of years. Definitely started with witchy romances and has kind of moved into the more supernatural and paranormal realm in a way that kind of harkens back to the paranormal supernatural romance of the mid-2000s, but admittedly feels a little bit more rom-com adjacent in its tone. I know I talked about this years ago when I did a video reading a bunch of the witchy romances that were coming out that year. So I'm very intrigued, but I'm very excited about this book in particular. I think it looks like a lot of fun. In a similar kind of supernatural rom-com vein, we also have A Werewolf's Guide to Seducing a Vampire by Sarah Hawley. This is the third in the Glimmer Falls series that started with A Witch's Guide to Fake Dating a Demon. Yes, and I have not read the second book in the series yet, which is A Demon's Guide to Wooing a Witch, but I remember I did the first on audio, and I remember having a lot of fun with it. I thought it was really charming, and I think the concept of this one looks really cute because it is following a werewolf who seems to be pretty introverted. He owns a plant store, and he is happy just going about his life until he orders a crystal online for 99 cents, in which there is a trapped vampire who has been cursed into this crystal that then enters his life and upsets it as she is seeking revenge against the witch that trapped her in this crystal and then sold her at a discounted price. The blurb also mentions that our werewolf Ben has an anxiety disorder, which I really appreciate. I really like seeing that representation, and I know we get it from our female love interests a lot in romance, especially as romance is, whether this is correct or not, largely considered a genre driven by women, seeing that reflection in the characters that a lot of readers may or may not project themselves onto while reading, that is validating. But I also like the idea of, one, men readers having that representation, but also just having more versions of love reflected, the human experience reflected, and all of the ways that relationships can work, all of the different personality types in relationships, getting to see everybody have love. And I love seeing people with anxiety get their happily ever after. So I think this looks really cute, and I am excited about this one as well. I would anticipate doing this one on audio like I did the first, and eventually probably also need to do the second, but I really did think these were a lot of fun on audio. Next, with the amount we've talked about Psyche and Eros this year, I would be remiss if I didn't mention The Palace of Eros by Caro de Robertis, which features a non-binary Eros, which I think is a really smart and interesting interpretation to explore within this story, within this myth. And it appears like it's going to be following the myth pretty closely in terms of the given circumstances and the beats of the myth itself, potentially, at least in the way that it is portrayed in the blurb. I'm additionally interested in reading this in conversation, or considering it in conversation, with Psyche and Eros, which I read earlier this year. It came out last year, but I am very interested to see the renewed interest in this tale. I mean, it's good for me, and maybe, hopefully, this will lead to a renewed interest in the fairy tale East of the Sun, West of the Moon, which I have previously mentioned is one of my personal favorite fairy tales as well. and is based in the psyche and Aerosmith, but I am, of course, interested, intrigued by a new interpretation of this myth. Next, we have Clickbait by Holly Baxter, which follows a disgraced journalist after an ethics violation, as she is kind of forced by necessity after her life falls apart in wake of this violation to join a publication that is essentially a clickbait factory. And while I'm assuming this book is literary fiction that really kind of follows her downward spiral, framed and kind of centered around this idea of clickbait, and especially the kind of mindlessness of it, the senselessness of it, there's just so much to explore there, and that is the exploration I'm actually interested in relation to this book. I am fascinated by kind of clickbait and virality and this chasing of clicks and views and what it kind of does to the psyche, especially in relation or kind of contrasted against real journalism. And we've seen real journalism gutted in favor of this model. And so I'm assuming there's commentary regarding the kind of state of affairs of that in this novel as well, but also the kind of illustration and use of the idea of these kinds of articles as a reflection of a mental state and that downward spiral is very interesting. And I hope that there is a conversation in here somewhere as well, even if it's subtext, about the nature of these kinds of articles. I'm intrigued by that angle of things, but either way, we will see what this ends up being. And then we've got the first more standard thriller that I've been interested in for a second, Society of Lies by Lauren Ling Brown, which follows a sister as she is going back for a reunion at her alma mater, Princeton, and is expecting this to be just a joyous weekend with both the reunion and because her younger sister is now a student there, only for her younger sister to turn up dead and it be ruled an accident. But Maya doesn't believe it was an accident. She believes it's somehow related to a secret society that she suspects her sister has joined because she was also a part of this secret society and had actually warned her sister not to join. So I think that secret society and that kind of dark academia aspect in combination with the thriller and the mystery piece is what is so compelling about this for me, but also this sisterly bond exploration and the secrets that Maya has seemingly been keeping. And so I'm interested to see how all of those secrets unravel and what we ultimately discover over the course of this book. And that was the most under control new release Tuesday of the month. So let's move on over to August 20th, starting with Drown Me with Dreams by Gabby Burton, which is the follow-up in the duology starting with Sing Me to Sleep, which follows a siren in this young adult dark fantasy. I, again, have not yet read Sing Me to Sleep. I had it checked out of the library. I didn't get it read in time. I had to take it back. The age-old story. But I want to circle back to this duology, and now that it's complete, I can read it all at once. So maybe that was a good move all along. I don't know. But I'm intrigued by this, especially because of the darkness that is kind of inherent here. And it seems like this second book is going to have a love triangle. I don't know if it seems like there's a love triangle at play in the first book, but the way it's set up, I'm intrigued. So we will see what it is, but I do like mermaid explorations, especially with some of that extra darker bite to it. So still very much intrigued by this one, and of course, the start of the series. Then, in a great timing move following the release of My Lady Jane, though I will be interested to see how much crossover there is in relation to sales, we have My Salty Mary by, of course, Cynthia Hand, Brody Ashton, and Jodi Meadows, which is finishing up the Mary trilogy that we got after the Jane trilogy. I do still need to read both the third book in the Jane trilogy, which you can see above my head in some videos. It may be covered by a book cover now, but it's still there, to my utter shame. And I need to read the second Mary book, so I am behind. But it will be interesting to see if there is a carryover in relation to the audience of My Lady Jane in this new book, especially as it is outside of the subject matter explorations of My Lady Jane, because it's not in the Tudor period. It is in fact following Mary Read, with, seemingly to tie us back to the book we just finished talking about, sprinklings of The Little Mermaid. Because some of these books being either the Jane series or the Mary series, have a kind of bleeding of real historical figures and literary figures, which I think is most evident, at least in the books that I've read, in the second Jane book, My Plain Jane. So I've definitely got my eye on this one, both from the series it's in, as well as this combination of The Little Mermaid and pirates. And I'm really interested to see how The Little Mermaid is explored in this, especially as The Little Mermaid from the Anderson tradition is a lot more theological than many would go in expecting in the reading. And I think it even mentions the sea foam in the blurb. But yeah, I think that this is just going to be another romp, and I always appreciate these books for a romp. And now with this being the kind of wrap up of the Mary series, kind of in the wake of the success of My Lady Jane. And if you haven't tuned into my discussion regarding My Lady Jane, hey, did you know that I have a discussion regarding My Lady Jane? It's a little chaotic, but so is My Lady Jane. But essentially, I'm going to be very interested to see if we get another trilogy out of them. And if so, what name are we going to follow? So lots to ponder there. But as we continue inching closer and closer to the fall with every release week, we have another supernatural paranormal romance with Rules for Ghosting by Shelley J. Shore, which is an exploration of a character who can see ghosts. And I, as many of you know, am on the hunt for a good romance with this kind of setup. I, as a lover of the Mediator series, really am intrigued by this. However, I will note this book is not setting up a relationship or a romance, which I clearly wanted to say when I tried to say relationship, with a ghost. Rather, our main character Ezra, whose relationship with his family is rather complicated, especially in wake of his transition, and who has kind of run as far as he can from the kind of legacy of his family and the responsibilities of the family business of the funeral home they run. But he's drawn back in wake, no pun intended there, but it hit me as it was coming out. Anyway, of losing a job that he really loved, a dream job, and a scandal involving his mother, he has come back to help run this funeral home. And Ezra begins to develop a crush on funeral home volunteer Jonathan, which is complicated when Ezra can see the ghost of Jonathan's deceased husband, Ben. And not only can he see the ghost, which in and of itself isn't as abnormal as we would think, presumably, he can interact with the ghost in a way that is abnormal in this world. And so I'm sure there are going to be lots of explorations of the ideas of hauntings and love lost and found within this novel, but I think the premise sounds really promising, and I am interested to see what we get. And then we have two historical romances back to back that I think would appeal to both fans or someone searching for something after Bridgerton season 3, or those searching for a romance after the Buccaneers, both of which we've discussed in more centered recommendation videos. But let's start with the book that may be, and again, I have not read these yet, for fans of Bridgerton season 3, Good Duke Gone Wild by Bethany Bennett, which follows a duke who has engaged a bookseller to liquidate the library of his late wife. This duke is also, of course, in need of an heir, but this puts him in proximity of Caroline, who also writes erotic novels under a pen name, which we have seen before recently. And so she is trying to keep this secret even as these two are becoming closer, because the revelation of this secret threatens her in some way, presumably other than the obvious within the given circumstances of the book. The blurb is leading me to believe that the Duke may be some kind of inspiration for these novels, but I can neither confirm or deny because I have not yet read it. But it looks interesting, and here we have a romantic lead. Yes, we have a Duke, but we also have a heroine here who is not of the gentry. Speaking of that class diversity, we have The Heiress Masquerade by Madison Michaels, which may be for fans of the Buccaneers, though it does seem to deviate a little bit. We do start out with the idea of an American heiress going over to Britain to find a husband, or at least that's what her mother wants. But she has no interest in being a dollar princess. So instead, she swaps places with her poorer cousin for 6 weeks in order to apprentice at the family company and prove her worth in the industry, in her family's industry. But what she didn't account for was an attraction with her father's protege. Now, why these two have never met, I'm sure the book will explain to us, but is a question I have, but very intrigued by this one as well. Sticking with the romance theme, but moving into young adult contemporary, this next book is blurbed for fans of young royals, but as a millennial, I have to admit that the blurb makes me think immediately of The Prince and Me with Julia Stiles. We've got Prince of the Palisades by Julian Winters, which is following a young prince in the wake of some kind of scandal who is on a kind of redemption tour. And this redemption tour does not involve having a summer romantic rendezvous with one of the members of his boarding school, but it does indeed anyway. And so it looks like a fun royal romance. But to switch tones more into the kind of fall that is creeping in, we've got Third Wife of Faraday House by B.R. Myers, which feels like it has that kind of gothic leaning. The blurb makes me think of Bluebeard, whether or not that proves itself to be the inspiration or whether this proves to be a retelling of some kind. But it follows a young woman, Emmeline, who is craving to escape her stifling life, especially as her family is starting to present, as the blurb calls them, repugnant suitors. But she has her eye on a lieutenant. She just needs to make him propose. Unfortunately, that plan, that aim, ends in scandal, and she is forced to accept the proposal of the only man that offers in its wake, Captain Graves, only to arrive at his home and realize his former wife is still alive. And so these two presumably must band together to understand what sinister thing is going on in this home. And so there are seemingly a lot of Gothic elements at play here. And again, I love a Gothic. Next, we have The Full Moon Coffee Shop by Mai Mochizuki and translated from the Japanese by Jessie Kirkwood. This is seemingly a quirky, kind of magical book. I'm very intrigued by this. It is following a cafe that appears seemingly to those that most need and deserve it. And this cafe is run by talking cats who help people find their future. And this book, the blurb kind of seems to set out a bunch of different characters that are helped throughout the course of the book. So I feel like it's going to be kind of episodic, lyrical. I mean, I don't know yet, but I am intrigued by the premise. And with cozy fantasy being so popular right now, I think that this would definitely be up readers' alleys. I'm also on the search for Japanese books, as I have officially booked an upcoming vacation in Tokyo, and I'm sure we will revisit that in the near future, but this is definitely on my radar for either before or during the trip. And if you have more recommendations, leave them below. I'm sure there will be more opportunities to continue to leave them below, but I need recommendations. Finally, for the 20th, we have We Love the Nightlife by Rachel Collar Croft, which is such a good title. And I'm sure I will contradict myself later in this video in mentioning another book that has a song lyric title that I don't gel with quite as much, but this one, perfect, at least for me, because we are following vampires in this book, nightlife, and not just vampires, vampires involved in a toxic relationship that started in the disco era, and they are attempting to kind of recalibrate or save this relationship one last time, though one of these vampires, the newer vampire, has an escape route kind of working through the course of this by opening a club together that is focusing on disco. So we love the nightlife. I think it's just really good. And I love this cover with the fangs. We've got that kind of vampy feel. I don't know how I feel about the disco era officially being on the vampire radar, but there was also at least that one flashback in Buffy with Spike that was around the same era, so I think it counts. I think we're okay. But I am very interested in this for, of course, the vampire angle. I may have to rate or rank all of the vampire books I've read this year, and I haven't even read all of the vampire books this year, I don't think. We'll circle back to that. But the vampire element, yes. But also this idea of this like long-standing toxic relationship, and it's framed as a toxic female friendship, which is interesting enough in and of itself, but with the vampire angle added on top, usually one of the appeals of vampires as a trope of vampirism is this kind of shedding of mores and societal constraints as the decades pass, and this kind of idea of this life lived outside of society proper. There are a lot of layers there, and vampires have always felt inherently queer to me a lot of the time, and so I am very interested to see if that is an angle of exploration in this at all. Either way, I think it's still going to be interesting, but it's definitely an angle of consideration. However, on the other side, the idea of exploring a like almost 50-year, according to the blurb, I don't know if the math on that fully tracks. I feel like we're rounding up a little bit, but it's none of my business. But a female friendship, a toxic female friendship of that longevity, that is interesting as well. There is so much to unpack with that. And then to throw disco on the top, I do think it's interesting on top, especially when we consider some of the things that come to mind when we think of the disco era. So just very excited to see what we get from these vampires and how they present and how much glitter is involved in different ways than we've had from vampire books in the past. The glitter feels more intrinsic to the world here. How's everybody doing? We hanging in there? If you are hanging in there with me still, I am glad. And we are officially to the last new release Tuesday of the month, August 27th, starting strong with yet another series I have started and need to catch up on before reading this book, Marriage and Masti by Nisha Sharma, which is the third in her If Shakespeare Was an Auntie series, and this is the 12th Night book. Now, I love 12th Night, and actually, I think 12th Night I have somehow seen or been involved with more than other Shakespeare that you would expect to be produced more, but I also come by it honest in that I was a great lover and continue to be a great lover of She is the Man. I still count it as one of my favorite movies, so I'm really excited to see how this book interprets or is in conversation with 12th Night, especially because, and I touched on this in the feature Friday for Dating Dr. Dill, I think that Dating Dr. Dill was in really excellent conversation with, I almost said Kiss Me Kate, but that is not right, and also wouldn't be the first time I've done that. It is, in fact, The Taming of the Shrew, of which Kiss Me Kate is also an adaptation. However, I think that that book did a really good job of being in conversation, of updating where needed, especially in the context of a romance, where there is a marriage at the end of the Shakespearean play, but I would not ever argue that it is a happily ever after, and so there have to be alterations made to that, and so it's about where the beats are changed and what the references are, rather than being completely beat by beat to the text and just updated that way. So I am very interested because this seems like it's going to be very similar and in vein then with things like She's the Man, where there are these sprinklings and you can see the beginnings, but it is also updated in a really fun way. And I believe this one involves I would argue a marriage of convenience in some ways that starts as an accidental wedding, potentially. I don't know. I'm going to have to read it to find out, but I'm very excited to see. And I do have the second book in the series that I own that I just need to actually read. Next, a book that I may not spend too much time on because I was getting oddly emotional thinking about this book, and I don't even remember the original as well as I should. And that is The Frindle Files by Andrew Clements, which is a posthumous return to the idea of Frendel. And as a millennial, look, why am I getting him? I barely remember Frendel. I remember the cover, but I think that that book is just such a seminal book to a lot of millennials. It was one of those books that just felt like it was everywhere when I was a young reader. And it's on par with things like Holes and Maniac McGee and There's a Boy in the Girl's Bathroom or Wayside School is Falling Down. And it just means a lot. And so the idea that we're returning to it, and we're returning to it with a character who is very interested in technology. We're looking at the world as it is today, but also returning to the world as we knew it. And this student is required by one particular teacher to not use technology, that technology is banned in his classroom. He doesn't even use a smartboard, according to the blurb. And so the return to the idea of Frendel. And I'm very interested to see if it does explore similar ideas of how language is used and created, especially in the current space where there's a lot of conversation about every generation and the slang that comes with every generation, which has always been the kind of case. However, I think we've seen it really expedited. And so I'm very interested to see if that is still part of this book or not, but just what it is, like what this last book from Andrew Clements is. But yeah, it's just really nostalgic. It's really emotional. I don't even know how I stumbled across this release. I don't remember because I haven't heard it talked about like at all. But I'm very intrigued, and I'm very interested in particular to see how young readers are going to respond to this book, or how people who are in the middle grade space, the early reader space, are talking about this book, responding to this book, if they're teaching this book, if they implement it in their classrooms, if it is used in tandem with Frindle and looked at in terms of the span of time and what changes. I don't know. I think there's a lot of possibility there. Next, we have Long Live Evil by Sarah Rees Brennan, which follows a girl who I believe was terminal or is terminal as she is drawn into her favorite fantasy series and realizes she is in fact the villain, but that's okay because villains have more fun and have all of the quippy one-liners anyway, and gathers the other villains or antagonists of this world into a group of some kind. Maybe there's epic battles, I don't know, but I'm sure, knowing Sarah Rees Brennan, that there are in fact zingy one-liners. It feels like a kind of variation of Descendants while also being related to her book that I own and have not read, In Other Lands, and that idea of like being pulled into a fantasy world. So I'm very interested to see the kind of evolution of that and exploring it from this realm of evil and kind of giving in to being the villain, real make me your villain energy. I am intrigued as well because I believe this is listed as adult, so that is one of the deviations then potentially, as well as traditionally she has really written for young adult audiences, so that is particularly intriguing, especially as I feel like the tone may be different for adult versus young adult, especially in relation to how we conceive of villains and how campy it ends up being. I don't know. Are we going to lean in to the camp? Are we going to lean into the more sinister? I guess we'll find out. And it is also listed as romance or having romantic elements, but I haven't been able to piece from the blurb exactly how those romantic elements are going to play out. I do have hopes there though, because her Liburn Legacy series is still, I haven't read it or thought about it actively in a long time in terms of remembering actively the plot of it, but I really remember enjoying the romantic aspects of that series, so I am hopeful. Now, in talking about the Sarah Rees Brennan and remembering the Liburn Legacy books, it brought me back to the fact that I had forgotten a book from the 6th, because these two authors kind of go together in my mind, whether it's because I was reading the Liburn Legacy and The Name of the Star by Maureen Johnson around the same time or what, but I do consider Maureen Johnson in tandem with Sarah Rees Brennan a lot in my own reading life. And with that, on August 6th, we have a new standalone mystery from Maureen Johnson, Death at Morning House. This is also a reminder to myself and me telling on myself that I do need to finish the Truly Devious series. And I really, really enjoyed that first book. So that is a travesty in and of itself. But this is a standalone mystery set on an island. And I really have enjoyed what I've read, Truly Devious, of Johnson's mysteries. Though, no, I would argue The Name of the Star also had a mystery element to it, and I still really enjoy that series a lot as well, though of course that involves ghosts and the supernatural in a way that I don't remember being overt in Truly Devious, but maybe that becomes something later in other books, I can't say. But very interested in what this ends up being. I really like Johnson's tone. There is a comedy there even amidst the seriousness that I think balances really well. But this is also a great opportunity for me to remind us all that there are going to be books that I forget. These are just the things on my radar. Inevitably, there are always books like I'm like, shoot, after either I finish filming or I'm editing or it's been up for a week and then I remember that one book. So if there are books that you are excited about that I haven't talked about, please, please leave those below because I would also like to know what else people are excited about. Now, swinging back to our normal timeline and the 27th, next is a book that I am cautiously excited about, which I know sounds shady, but bear with me. Next we have Confounding Oaths by Alexis Hall. This seems to still be in the same series as Mortal Follies, which is a kind of supernatural, fantastical comedy historical romance series, which sounds perfect. It sounds like everything I want out of life, especially when you consider that Mortal Follies was narrated by Puck of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Sounds right up my alley. But if you were with me when I read Mortal Follies, when I talked about it in a wrap-up, I actually really disliked that book because it felt meandering. It felt like the quirk overpowered the actual narrative and it just went on too much at times. Puck got to be distracting rather than as an addition and a kind of enhancement to the story. I was just really sad that that book didn't work for me in the way that I really, really wanted it to. However, I am still really interested in the world, and I have liked Alexis Hall's work before in books like Boyfriend Material, and so Confounding Oaths is a gay romance set in the same world as Mortal Follies. I'm not gonna lie to you, I think it is following characters that were set up in Mortal Follies, and I'm hoping that that is what it is, but I don't remember the names well enough to confirm that to you here, but I am just intrigued by this, hopeful that maybe this will have taken some of the critique and feedback of Mortal Follies, though to be fair, it worked for a lot of people. It's okay that it just didn't work for me. So maybe, I don't know. I don't know. But I'm willing to give it another try because I've liked Hall's work in the past. I know that sometimes with authors, books can be hit or miss for me, and I just like the premise of it. So I can't promise that it's going to be first on my list. I don't know when I will get around to it, but I will definitely be paying attention to people's reactions to this book. And to stay in the queer historical romance space a little bit longer, we have You're the Problem, It's You by Emma R. Albin. This is the same author of Don't Want You Like a Best Friend, and I will admit that I have not read that book largely because of the title, and this is where we circle back to titles and referential titles that work or don't work for me, because We Love the Nightlife I liked. The Taylor Swift lyric titles I should like because I like Taylor Swift, but I don't know how I feel about them. I don't know. I would be very interested to hear your thoughts about these titles if you have thoughts below. Again, it's not make or break. It's not an end of the world scenario by any means. I just don't know how I personally feel about them, but I am still very interested in the books. And this one seems to be a kind of antagonistic but attracted relationship between two gentlemen who went to school together, and one has recently inherited a title and one has more activist type leanings potentially, and just the kind of clash that occurs in terms of their perceptions of each other and also their worldviews or perceptions of the other's worldviews and whether they are correct or not, as well as the attraction that is at play as well. And so despite the title, I am still intrigued, which moves us right into another title, which I promise I'm not just being a downer toward the end of this video, but these are all books that I'm intrigued by, but there is still there's like a piece of reservation whether it means anything or not, or is warranted or not, I don't know. But next we have, and yes, I am going to have to read this out, Sunderworld, Volume 1, The Extraordinary Disappointments of Leopold Barry by Ransom Briggs, which is the first, to my knowledge, new series we've gotten from Riggs since the Peculiar Children series ended. And I will admit to not loving that series. I liked the concept of it. I read the first book, I maybe read the second book, but it got kind of old for me fast. And to be fair, by the time I was reading them, I probably wasn't the target audience. I was in my early 20s. However, I was still reading a lot of young adult at that time, and a lot of young adult really still worked for me. And I would argue that that series was aimed at a younger young adult crowd, which I applaud and think is important. So that's not the issue. I just felt like while the pictures were a really cool concept and idea, I felt like the plot worked so hard to write itself to the pictures rather than the pictures feeling like they were kind of organic supplements of the plot and working in tandem. It just felt forced to me personally, despite the fact that I really liked the idea and the concept and the impetus behind everything. Probably an unpopular opinion. I accept that. However, I am still very interested in Riggs's brain because that is still a very interesting concept, and particularly interested in this kind of world that seems to be established of this short-lived show, fantasy show that exists on VHS, the fact that the book looks like a VHS. So yes, it is playing into that nostalgia, but I'm interested in how Riggs is going to approach this world, what the form of this book is going to look like, whether we're going to see innovation in line with Peculiar Children, whether or not you viewed it as successful or I viewed it as successful. It was undeniably imaginative and innovative in terms of how it was playing with the form. Absolutely. So I'm still very interested in that aspect of things and what world we're going to be creating here and exploring the tone of things. So I'm still very interested in this. I am probably definitely going to be paying attention to reviews of this. I feel like I haven't seen it around a whole lot yet. Maybe I just haven't been paying attention to the right spaces, but it would seem like it would be a pretty big and notable release, but we will see. And finally, what is a big and notable release, at least for me, and one of the books I'm most excited for this month, and the final book we will be talking about today, Amari and the Despicable Wonders by B.B. Alston, which is the third in the Amari and the Knight Brothers series, which, yes, I have already pre-ordered the third book from Waterstones to complete my collection, or to keep my collection together. And I actually just read the blurb for the first time today because I knew I was going to read this book. I'm excited for this book regardless, and we will just have to go on the adventure. I'm probably not going to talk about that blurb too much, except that the world of this book, Amari's world, is in chaos. This does seem like this is going to be the kind of turbulent book. The kind of bad regime has taken over, and Amari and her friends are on the hunt for a collection of artifacts that contain power in order to help overthrow this regime, as well as Amari's brother is back in the picture after having been away for a couple of books due to supernatural circumstances. And so I'm very excited to see what that dynamic brings to the table, as well as how we've seen Amari continue to grow, her friend group continue to grow. I'm very excited to continue with these characters that I love, though I am sad that this is going to be a darker book, though I of course recognize conflict and escalation and overarching arcs of storytelling. All that aside, I do still love exploring the world of the school in Amari and the Night Brothers, and I will miss that, as it seems like we are going to be even more away from that in this book, and we were already kind of complicating that and moving away from that more as well in the second book. The first book is our time to get to explore that world, and then we have to start pushing out of the bounds. I get it, but I am interested to see what bounds we're going to push, what parts of the supernatural mythical world we're going to explore in this book, what challenges Amari and her friends go up against, what changes may happen for her friends. I love watching her friends come into their own as well as her, and the balance and change of these friendships. I love these characters and how they're allowed to grow and change and be flawed and make mistakes, and they work through friendship troubles together and forgive each other or don't sometimes. It's just, it feels very true to development at that time. It feels like reflections that middle grade readers need to see, and most importantly, it's just imaginative and full of wonder. And as I mentioned before, these books have kind of reintroduced me to a wonder that I feel is very specific to middle grade fiction, and that I was afraid that I would never find again. And so these books bring a lot of joy into my life. I want them to just keep coming, and am very excited for my pre-order of this book to arrive. And yeah, we will talk about it more, I am sure. But with that, those are all of the books that I have on my radar for the month. I would love, again, to hear what you're excited about, whether we talked about it today or not, as well as if any of these books you would be interested in hearing about more in depth in a future Friday. Please let me know, and I will do my best to prioritize so that we can dig in a little bit more that way as well. But as always, thank you so much for hanging out with me and being interested in my thoughts about books and sharing your thoughts about books with me as well. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good, and yeah, bye.